Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for day 2 of the symposium. So today's moderator is going to be Professor Johnson, and Professor Johnson is an expert in legal writing, sexual orientation and the law, appellate advocacy, and constitutional law. Professor Johnson earned his BA in Cornell University in 1982 and a JD degree from Notre Dame Law School in 1985. He joined the Vermont Law and Graduate School faculty in 1997. He has made numerous presentations across the nation for LGBTQIA civil rights issues. He testified before both houses of the Vermont legislature when it considered the Civil Union Bill in 2000 and the landmark Marriage Equality Bill in 2009. Professor Johnson has also spoken at national and regional legal writing conferences. He has served on numerous legal writing committees. He was the chair of the Scholarship Grants Committee of the Association of Legal Writing Directors from 2012 to 2017. Let's give Professor Johnson a round of applause.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mei Lee, and welcome everyone to the panel. We're really excited to have this stellar group of panelists present on the very important topic of whether prisons are obsolete and is abolition the answer. I'll provide the bios of each of the panelists, and then each panelist will have 10 to 15 minutes to speak. We have some set questions already lined up for the panelists, but as well, we definitely welcome questions from the floor. So our first speaker is Susanna Davis. Susanna serves as the State of Vermont's Executive Director of Racial Equity, working with state agencies to identify and address systemic racial disparities to ensure that equity goals and objectives are incorporated throughout the state's operations. Prior to joining the state of Vermont, Susanna served as Director of Health and Housing Strategic Initiatives at the New York City Department of Health and Mental Hygiene, and also as Director of the Black, Latino, and Asian Caucus of the New York City Council. She holds a Juris Doctor with a concentration in international human rights law from New York Law School. She studied anthropology and philosophy at Fordham University, earning the Reverend J. Franklin Ewing Award for writing on the relationship between global human rights and the proliferation of HIV/AIDS. Susanna is first generation in the U.S. and proud to be a Spanish-fluent Latina who approaches her work from a multicultural perspective. Dr. Jason Williams is an associate professor of justice studies at Montclair University and a passionate activist criminologist deeply concerned about racial and gender disparity and mistreatment within the criminal legal system. Dr. Williams earned his PhD in Administration of Justice from Texas Southern University. He has conducted ethnographic research in Baltimore, Maryland, and Ferguson, Missouri, following the police-involved tragedies of Freddie Gray and Michael Brown. Dr. Williams is now beginning police and community-based research in Newark, New Jersey, following a federal consent decree that proved pervasive unconstitutional policing practices. Dr. Williams has published extensively on returning citizens and their navigation through reentry. He recently co-edited a book entitled Black Males and the Criminal Justice System. Jax, they, them, LL, is proudly queer Borica attorney who has been working to dismantle the criminal justice system. Jax earned their JD from Hofstra University's Maurice A. Dean School of Law. While in law school, Jax served as the president of the Latina Law Student Association and the Northeast Director of the National Latino Law Student Association. Jax earned their undergrad degree from Lafayette College, where they were awarded an athletic scholarship and graduated with honors from the Government and Law Department. After law school, Jax worked in law enforcement for 5 years, first as a prosecutor in the Domestic Violence Unit in Brooklyn, New York, and then as an investigator into police practices and policies in New York City. Upon leaving law enforcement, Jax served as criminal justice policy expert in the Vera Institute of Justice. Currently, Jax is working in the New York City Asylum Application Help Center, filing asylum applications of recent arrived immigrants from Latin America. Jax has also served on the New York City Bar Association LGBTQ+ Committee and the New York Police Department LGBTQ+ Advisory Board, the Dominican Bar Association, and the Hispanic National Bar Association Region 2. Jax has dedicated their work to creating safe community spaces for healing and rejuvenating our bodies, minds, relationships, families, and communities, while fighting for the liberation from the white supremacy and globalized capitalist imperialism that is destroying our environment and land. With that as an introduction of our very distinguished panel, Director Davis, you go first.
All right. Good morning, everybody. Buenos dias. I'm Susana, and it's really an honor to be here. It's particularly an honor to be on a panel alongside Jax and Dr. Williams. I hope I can do it justice, pardon the pun. I guess, in thinking about the title of today's panel, Are Prisons Obsolete? For me, I'm thinking, what does it really mean for something to be obsolete? It means that it's served its purpose. It's run its course. It's no longer compatible with the surrounding setup that we currently have. And I suppose the question is, has the carceral system done that? Has it run its course? Has it served its purpose? And really, that's going to depend on what we see as the purpose. In this country, that has meant historically removal from society, punishment and shame, which are deep drivers of a lot of what we do in this country, and maintenance of a social order, particularly around race and class lines. So given those, sadly, prisons aren't obsolete. Because even though today we have a lot more info about things like criminality and the psychology behind it, we've got methodologies to treat physical illness, mental illness. We've let go of theories like phrenology and demons. We have programs like free school lunch and Big Brother and mentorship programs. We've got pathways to higher education, but all of those don't solve the problem of how do we remove undesirables from society? How do we adequately shame people? And how do we maintain those social hierarchies by oppressing people who annoyingly keep gaining civil rights protections in this country? And so for that reason, sadly, while prisons, I think, should be obsolete if their only purpose were public safety and rehabilitation, it's so far from what they're actually designed to do that it means that no, they're not obsolete if we admit that their purpose is to maintain that social and political and thought control over the masses. And, a lot of times people talk about the system, capital T, capital S, as if it's broken. And in reality, it's not. It's well-oiled and it's running smoothly exactly as intended. I think what's difficult sometimes for people to accept is that what we have here was always intentional, right? This wasn't a product of revolutionary ideals from a persecuted few who left Europe to come here in search of a better life. This is a system that was designed to hoard power and to concentrate it and to go stomping around the world, eliminating whomever they had to in order to claim that land and power. And the prison system is a natural outgrowth of that. But I want to back up a little bit because it's really not just the carceral system itself that upholds the carceral system in this country. People end up incarcerated for a really wide variety of reasons because there's a wide variety of pathways that lead to incarceration. So I want to talk a little bit about the systems that buttress the carceral system in the U.S. And I think first we have to acknowledge there's us, just as individuals. Nobody in positions of power could really get away with any of this unless we were letting them. And what I'm not saying is that we're not trying to fix things. Prison abolition efforts have existed in this country longer than I've been alive. We wouldn't be here on a Saturday at this symposium if this weren't a real and prescient and important movement. So I don't mean to imply that no one's doing anything, but there are certain options to us that we have available that we simply don't exercise in large enough numbers. You're allowed to recall an elected official. How often do we do it? Or do we just kind of wait it out until their term is up? And then we tell people, you got to get out and vote. And by the way, if you've been convicted of a felony, good luck with that. And then we just kind of hope that the voters do the right thing. It seems to me like a lot of waiting and hoping and trusting in an electoral system that routinely and increasingly fails us. I mean, that's just one example to highlight that we're each responsible for who's put in those positions, those key roles that are fueling the carceral system. Second, let's talk a little bit about housing, because prisons are really remarkable. They're often where people go because they don't have housing, and they themselves are a form of housing. But they're some of the most destructive and dangerous housing that exists in the US, right? For example, in the climate change dialogue. And I know Vermont Law Graduate School really has its roots as an ecology-centered institution. Let's talk about the climate crisis. You know, a lot of times we have local municipalities that talk about cooling centers. They set up cooling centers when we talk about extreme heat periods, because the idea is that being indoors is supposed to be safer than being outdoors during periods of extreme heat. But look at this past summer and the heat waves that we saw and the temperatures that jails and prisons were reaching around the country. Okay, we were cooking people. And so much of the narrative ended up devolving into, well, they're criminals. Why do we want them to be comfortable? Okay, so we know that housing through incarceration doesn't necessarily protect you from, say, climate disaster. It doesn't even solve your transportation issues, right? I want to go back and say their names. Let's talk about Nicolette Green and Wendy Newton in South Carolina, when a sheriff's deputy was transporting them in a van, and the floodwaters from their recent hurricane, and this was 2018, so that was Hurricane Florence, the floodwaters rose so high that the sheriff's deputy fled the van and left those two women for dead. And that sheriff's deputy, and by the way, you cannot make this stuff up. His actual name was Stephen Flood. Ended up getting 18 years in prison, and who knows if he'll even really serve them all. But this is just another way that shows us that we're fueling the prison system and keeping them open for business by just cycling more and more people through as if it's some kind of a universal fix. I digress. So we know that housing through incarceration does not help. We know that transportation through incarceration is also equally dangerous. It can't protect us from things like climate and natural disasters. What about other stuff? Let's say health issues. Well, let's look at physical health. We know that the incarcerated population is aging in the United States because we keep locking people up for a really long time. And so now the next big cash windfall is going to be which corporations can get all the contracts to retrofit America's prisons to make them more suitable for an increasingly geriatric population. Or let's pivot to mental health. And actually, to do that, I want to go back to Wendy and Nicolette in South Carolina. See, the reason they were even in that van that day is because they were en route to a facility because they had been ordered to be involuntarily committed, because they sought out mental health treatment. And we've heard this song many times before. Black man calls police for help, ends up getting killed by them, right? They sought mental health treatment. They were ordered involuntarily committed. And in fact, their families insisted they weren't violent. But that did not stop the court system from sending them against their will to be treated in a way that probably would not have been much of a solution for them anyway. Now, of course, we don't have time today to get into the fact that Western medicine undermines our community's traditional healing by labeling our practices as unscientific or not rigorous, and instead they want to throw a pill at everything. We don't really have time to get into the fact that that pill is going to cost you $112 each, and the side effects are probably going to be more harrowing than the symptoms. And we don't have time to discuss how often some of the best treatments for physical and emotional problems are those systemic fixes. For example, that Black mother who battles chronic stress and anxiety because she worries that her Black son won't make it home from school that night and will end up on the evening news, murdered by the government. Of course, we can prescribe her something for that anxiety, but that prescription doesn't shield her son from the risks of walking while Black every day. It's not a real solution, right? It's just another medically documented reason to say, see, she's not fit. She can't handle the pressure. She's mentally ill. And so we talk a lot about mental health interventions in the criminal justice system, and including more trained professionals in the mental health space to reduce the likelihood that people end up incarcerated, for example, through police encounters. But let's actually examine the ways in which that really plays out. I'm thinking back to Miami, Florida. This was 2016. You likely heard about this. There was a 27-year-old man. He was autistic, nonverbal, and he had left his group home. Now, he was a patient of a therapist whose name was Charles Kinsey, who happened to be a Black man. And the patient was in the middle of the street. He was upset, he was agitated, and Charles, the therapist, was with him trying to calm him down and get him to a safe place. The police showed up. Charles is trying to manage the situation as best he can. He's sort of negotiating between the patient and the police. And then all of a sudden, one of the officers shoots Charles. Now, he's shot in the leg. It's a non-lethal gunshot, but then the police handcuffed him and left him laying in the street for 20 minutes before rendering any medical attention. And by the way, it turns out they weren't even trying to shoot Charles. They were aiming for his autistic nonverbal patient, and they missed. So even when we talk about bringing mental health professionals to the scene, one of the first responses we hear is, well, we still have to have police there because we got to keep the mental health workers safe at the scene. Are we though? And just I'll say for the sake of closure, I'll tell you what happened in the end of that case. The officer who shot Charles was sentenced to probation. Plus, he had to write a 2,500-word essay on policing. He served 5 months of that probation, and then actually last year, 2022, his conviction got overturned. So a lot of this particular situation, so much of it is based on this foundational concept that in this country, society has really long believed that people living with disabilities aren't fit to exist alongside people not living with disabilities. Right? This is why it was so easy to aim for a disabled man experiencing a crisis in the middle of the street, and why the accidental shooting of the Black man beside him was equally acceptable as collateral damage for the average bigoted viewer. For multiple centuries, people in this country have fought really hard to make sure that no matter what the courts say, that they can find new and exciting and creative ways to keep people incarcerated and enslaved. It's why they had chain gangs after emancipation. It's why they use prison labor to fight wildfires on the West Coast. And then when those people are released, they're prevented legally from actually being firefighters. It's why they used to have ugly codes in cities across the country where people who were deemed to be too ugly and too deformed were actually fined or imprisoned. There was one woman who actually got paid to move out of her city because she was considered so grotesque. This is why they made felon disenfranchisement laws and then carefully selected which offenses would be felonies and which ones wouldn't, based on which racial groups were more likely to commit which offenses. So that brought us to a place where in several states in this country, you could lose your vote for beating your wife, but not for killing her. Same with sentencing disparities between rock and powder cocaine. All of this really speaks to this consistent truth that in the US, the legal system, and therefore necessarily the carceral system, work really beautifully to make sure that you remain in your place, and that if you don't, that your new place is behind bars. So I'm already at time, but I just want to end with one more thing. We talked about sort of the holistic view of how different aspects of everyday life really can represent pathways to incarceration. And I want to go back to that original idea that I started with, which was why do we incarcerate? What are the reasons that we incarcerate? And whether those reasons are good ones or bad ones, whether they're effective or ineffective, there's still another factor that we're not discussing that often, which is the incarcerated person's response to being incarcerated. And really that speaks to how humanity itself is viewed in the US. And I want to talk about that in comparison to some other countries by sharing this example with you. So one of the members of my household is of German descent and years ago told me something, and there's debate about this, but it seems like it's true from what I'm seeing. And that's that in Germany, it's not considered a crime to try to escape from prison. And evidently this is true in a couple of other countries like Belgium and Austria, and I think Mexico, at least as recently as 20 years ago. And the thing about that is that the idea behind it is that the desire to be free is so innate to a human being that they view the right to freedom and the right to seek freedom as being separate, and that the human urge to be liberated from bondage shouldn't result in further punishment. Now, there's a whole lot of caveats to that. It's not like everybody out here is tunneling with a sardine can out of German prisons left and right. They'll find ways to charge you. For example, you could walk out all of the doors being wide open. If you're wearing their uniform, it's theft of government property and they'll charge you for that. So it's not that clean. It's not a gotcha moment. But that's not really the point. The point is that it's about recognizing that when we incarcerate, it goes against every fiber of our being to be caged. And that because of that, it's an action that can't be taken on a whim, right? The mass incarceration in this country really shows us that in the US, we've lost the plot. We've forgotten that bondage is so unnatural and that it is so extreme to the fundamental existence of what it means to be a person, that it can't be taken lightly. It's got to be wielded responsibly. It can't just be our nation's go-to quick fix for dealing with people and problems that we don't like. And that's how you know, and by the way, that's how you know the people out here talking about slavery wasn't so bad. That's how you know they're full of it. Because you wouldn't have had the slave patrols and the bounty hunters if you didn't think people were going to want to be escaping those conditions. You wouldn't have printed specific editions of the Bible that were slave editions that removed all references to slavery, bondage, freedom, and liberation. And I want you to think about that. A religion that was forced upon people around the world. One of its first books in its holy text is the story of Exodus, freedom from slavery, and that you have to not only extract that from the slave edition of your Bibles, because you don't want anybody to read those kinds of things, but on top of it, that you can simultaneously hold that in your mind, that story, and simultaneously hold the story that by the time the Americans had perfected its cruelty, that slavery wasn't that bad. I mean, that's why you can't take these people serious. It's like we say in Spanish, ni tú te lo crees, like it translates to you don't even believe yourself. So I'll stop there. I appreciate the time. I guess really to wrap, if I were just to give one quick summary of all that, it's that we absolutely have so much work to do when it comes to the carceral system. And we also have pathways that all have roads that lead to the carceral system. And so if you're in the human services field, if you're in education, if you're in finance, if you're in housing, there's absolutely a role for you to play, because someone in America is following a pathway from where you are to a cell. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that powerful presentation. And I might add law to your list. So, Dr. Williams, you're next.
Thank you. Thanks again for the invitation and to be here with all of you. Agree with everything that you mentioned. And I too argue in the affirmative that prisons as we know them are just completely obsolete, and they are obsolete for a variety of reasons. And first, I would say too that the mechanisms that we use to usher folks into prison are themselves woefully inept. Police officers, prosecutors, and the courts are equally incapable of ensuring a fair process of justice free from the influence of racism, sexism, so forth and so on. And this is largely due to our program of race neutralization within the administration of justice, which should force us to really reckon and question, why so many people end up in prison in the first place. A system that can't see the whole of a problem isn't worthy of being legitimated as a justice system. We've yet to really grapple with the role that white supremacy has played, right? And in the orchestration of our system, going back from its infancy all the way up into the present day. And so that certainly isn't a system worthy of being legitimated. Our recidivism rate has remained steadily high, with about 70%, I believe, of formerly incarcerated individuals returning to prison within 5 years of release. That in and of itself is a damning indictment, I would say, against the prison. We have scores of examples of how the prison violates the 8th Amendment, some of which I've already mentioned. Race neutralization in and of itself, I would argue, is a human rights violation. See me as a whole individual. I am a descendant of slaves in a white supremacist country that has produced laws time and time again to repress and oppress me. So if I'm coming before the court, I would like to be seen as a whole individual. Anyhow, we have routinely heard of credible reports of sexual abuse, torture, official misconduct all throughout our country, both at the state and federal levels. I can speak here in New Jersey. There was a recent consent decree with our only women's prison where they found that incarcerated women were routinely being sexually and physically assaulted. And interestingly, though, these same stories were being spoken about in the 90s and 2000s, but it took a consent decree for people to believe them and to begin to discuss them more seriously. There's also growing evidence that the Prison Rape Elimination Act has been insufficient in responding to in-prison sexual assaults, whether that be sexual assaults amongst the in-prison population or from COs themselves. And this, of course, is in large part due to the culture of dehumanization that governs U.S. prisons. Because yes, they largely exist within cultures of dehumanization. And by most measures, incarcerated LGBTQ youth, because we often forget about the kids, youth and adults, continue to report higher rates of sexual victimization. Prisons have always been an epidemiological nightmare. In just about every U.S. prison, there is the constant threat of communicable diseases spreading, whether it be through sexual acts, whether it be through the sharing of razors or other such ways. We've also seen this up close and personal during the COVID-19 pandemic, right? And so we have to also call attention to the non-communicable diseases and how the prison induces diseases like heart disease and diabetes and other such diseases, you know. And of course, some racial groups, particularly mine, African Americans, may be predisposed to certain non-communicable diseases, making the prison literally a threat against their life and health and well-being. Also, the discriminatory use of administrative detention continues to be a major problem. No human being, regardless of circumstances, deserve to be thrown in isolation for days in, days out, and then forced to develop all kinds of lifelong mental abnormalities as a result of being in prison. And of course, disproportionately used against LGBTQ individuals and folk of color, especially those of African descent. And then also the lack of true health care behind bars, I think, worsens the stability of those who are incarcerated, you know, making them worse off once they are released than when they had stepped foot into the prison. You know, the prison culture itself is perhaps a foremost reason as well for its obsolescence. You know, from the prison architecture, whether we're looking at the outside or the inside, to the rules that governs its grounds and the sort of hyper heteropatriarchy and masculinist ideology that seems to infect its policies and procedures, as well as the everyday lives of all who have to live and work within it. You know, the prison itself, as I mentioned earlier, is just recklessly indifferent to human life. It is utterly incapable, of rehabilitating anyone or anything. And another foremost reason for its obsolescence is how the prison really reinforces white supremacist ideals. You know, we can talk about prison gangs and, you know, how if you look at the hierarchy of gangs within the prison, obviously the white supremacist gangs tend to have more power within such a setting, and how prison administrators welcome these hierarchies. But, you know, when we think about this, the culture itself and the infestation of white supremacy, it further decapitalizes, I think, minoritized citizens, almost ensuring them lifelong condemnation. You know, and this is, as you mentioned earlier, consistent with policies from the not so distant past, particularly that of Jim Crow. You know, policies such as voter disenfranchisement, I think, accomplishes this goal as well. You know, prison has become a modern day mark, if you will, of the new Jim Crow, as Michelle Alexander has so eloquently argued, as well as the denial of social welfare services that were created in hopes of, you know, helping those who are in need. The stigmatization of being marked an ex-con all but ensures that a person is no longer a citizen. And what a cute way, right, to go about reinstituting Jim Crow, right, than relying on the prison and the criminal legal system and all of its processes as your mechanism of denying Blacks their right to exist, for one, right? But also their right to be an American citizen. You know, we now use the prison and the criminal legal system as a way to bring back those past practices. You know, and this has tremendously dangerous implications for the significance of race and our democratic experiment. And lastly, I think, too, we have to do a much better job vetting alternatives like home detention, because it may very well be the next frontier of the carceral commodification of human bodies for profit. And of course, disproportionately using poor and minoritized bodies to turn that profit. These alternatives are equally dangerous, as they are a drag on the mental well-being of those relegated to its control. You know, I've done a lot of research with returning citizens, And I tell you, all of these alternatives do not in no way guarantee us more peace and tranquility. In many cases, these are prosecutorial tactics. I know of one such case, young man, was 18 years old, accused of doing, it was carjacking, and they claimed that he had a weapon on his person and that he was with a group of individuals. I've known this young man since he was very, very young, about 3 years old to be exact. And I'm not saying this just because I know him, but I know this is nothing that he would ever think to do. Yet he was relegated to home detention and forced to wait months upon months upon months because the prosecution couldn't bring forth any real solid evidence to move the case forward as a result of waiting and waiting and waiting and not being able to go here and go there and do things that a freed citizen would like to do. He ended up copping the plea, right? And so here we have a wrongful conviction as a result of the so-called alternatives that are designed to help ameliorate, prison overcrowding and so forth and so on. So we really need to do a better job vetting these alternatives and holding, again, like I mentioned earlier, police officers and more importantly, prosecutors for the role that they play in this whole entire mess of mass incarceration. So I think for all of those reasons above, I vote in the affirmative. I don't think that prisons really play the role that we think in our modern day society, or if they have ever played a role in guaranteeing us peace and tranquility. So I'll return the rest of my time back to the panel, and I look forward to talking with the rest of you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Williams.
Thank you.
All right, Jax, you can present now, and after that, we'll take questions, but floor is theirs.
Hey, so honored to be included in this panel and to be speaking after the previous panelists. I had asked to go last because I have a tendency to ramble and I want to stay focused and responsive because there's just so much to say here. So I'm going to start by just grounding in who I am a little bit. So I'm somebody who works in communities. I'm a community organizer now, but been organizing for years. And I organize with communities who won't call the police. I organize with survivors of violence by both state apparatus and, well, some are, or people who have lost folks to systemic violence. Either it's from the police, child welfare system, immigration system, all of that we understand as being a part of mass incarceration system, medical industrial complex. All of those things are kind of tied together. I work with, I have people, my family has historically either didn't survive or lost, her families have been separated due to the medical industrial complex as it relates to poor motherhood, right? And the ways in which we monitor our families. So I tend to, when speaking to law students, give a little caveat that I'm going to be probably saying the things that, and I'm going to say them in the way that y'all may not be used to hearing because it needs to be said. I think that we have a duty and responsibility to the education and the privilege that we acquire as being law students and therefore lawyers to live in the realities that are that we're living in. Right? We need to acknowledge and live in the world outside of our own experiences and ground our experiences in those in the realities of the folks that the previous panels were talking about, the people who are subjected to the legal system of which we are learning about, the folks who were never a part of or give consent to the system in which we are born into. If we go back to at the time and even before this country was founded, there was a lot of fun talk around creating a society and, you know, this idea of a social contract, you know, and this United States governmental system has been imposed on generations of people. Me as a diasporic Puerto Rican person, you know, the American system is imposed on my people, right? On our people. As Black folks who were kidnapped and enslaved and trafficked, the legal system was imposed on you know, populations of people. The legal system imposed on Native folks who were pushed out and killed for the purpose of resources and land. So when I saw that I was invited to this panel, well, let me take a step back. I'm also coming at this as a former prosecutor. I worked in the Brooklyn District Attorney's Office for 4 years in domestic violence, where I worked with survivors of domestic violence and sexual abuse and human trafficking, because most people are sexually abused by people that they know, oftentimes even by their own partners or by former partners. So I also handled cases where it was a former partner as well, right? So I worked with people who did try to go to the system for help for the harm the very real and harm that they experienced. These are the cases that people usually prop up as an explanation or an excuse for why there has to be a criminal system response. I worked with those folks on the inside and have seen what it looks like for a survivor to have to take the stand in a grand jury, you know, and have to try to justify and explain, you know, the ways in which somebody else had taken advantage of them and how they didn't report it sooner, only to find that the system that they go to for help actually made everything worse. I also come from a family and personal experiences of experiencing sexual harm and not seeking help from the system and finding more safety in my own community. I work with folks who find safety in community and who have been doing so historically because of the criminal, quote unquote, criminal justice system that has been imposed on our families. So we work as an abolitionist, I work to render the criminal legal system useless, right? Because we can create safety in our own communities. And it's why I'm an advocate for what Susanna had brought up, universal housing. There are other solutions that would address this. So saying that, I want to go to the first thought that I had when I had heard that I was invited to this panel was the Federalist Papers. The first thought that I had was, if we're going to talk about the Eighth Amendment, let's talk about the Eighth Amendment, right? Let's talk about the Eighth Amendment. What is the language of the Eighth Amendment? I had written this down, right? It's about no punishment can't have cruel and unusual punishment. There's a qualifier, right? No excessive bail. So the concepts of detention and bail, those were already in existence. The Eighth Amendment codifies the state's monopoly on violence, and it codifies a system that will always be able to use detention. It actually ensured that indefinitely, almost indefinitely, because we already know the barriers to amend the Constitution, right? Like, it is almost impossible to actually try to amend the Constitution. So, and even if we were to try to do referendums, even if we were to try to handle it on the state level, it's going to get challenged. So the purpose, if we think about, and for folks who, y'all are law students, so you should know all about the Federalist Papers, and y'all, not gonna lie, should have already read at least some of them. But one of the main folks that is kind of like the founder that people point to is John Jay, right? And John Jay, at the time the Federalist Papers were written, he was concerned about violence and safety from foreign and domestic risks and threats to safety. who were considered the people that they were worried about their safety? Straight, white, property owning men who were slave holders and who killed Native people and raped Native women, routinely raped Black women, enslaved women, right? That's who was writing this Constitution. They were not writing anything to protect our individual rights. They were writing to protect their rights to property and to power. And we know that because at the time that the Federalist Papers were being written, the United States was not the United States at the time. And I think that this is why, as law students, it's incredibly important to understand your history. It is incredibly important to understand American history, especially when we're dealing with justices on the court who want to make originalist arguments. You want to talk about original arguments? What did the United States look like at the time that the Constitution was written? They were invading Native land, actively expanding north. They wanted Ohio. They were expanding and wanted to go past the Mississippi. What existed in the United States at the time. The people that were writing this were at what they call at war, foreign and domestic. Foreign considered Native Americans, because Native American folks at that time still had very robust communities. They had very robust, I don't want to say armies, but they had robust amounts of people who were actively fighting and winning against colonial settlers, who were the ones who were writing this Constitution, right? At present, this is what John Jay wrote. At present, I mean only to consider it as it respects security for the preservation of peace and tranquility for who, as well as against dangers from foreign arms and influence, as from dangers of the like kind arising from domestic causes. What were those domestic causes? Slave rebellions. The domestic causes were slave rebellions. And who was quelling slave rebellions at the time? Settler militias. Militias who were composed of white folks who were not plantation owners, right? They were composed of the slave drivers who were bribed by classist policies, either as freed Blacks or as property owning. I mean, not property owning. They were property. Or the poor white folks who were living in that area, right? That middle class. How is that any different than corrections officers? How is that any different than our court system? The Ruth Wilson Gilmore talks about the purpose of the criminal legal system. Yes, part of social control, absolutely, which is why I particularly wanted to go after our speakers, because I had a feeling that that was part of what y'all would expound upon, right? The criminal legal system is also about creating social control that can reinforce itself. And how does it reinforce itself? By giving the people who control that a vested interest in making sure it continues. And why do they have a vested interest? Because they got pensions, they got mortgages, they have lifestyles that are funded by all the mechanisms of the criminal legal system. As a prosecutor, and I'll just walk this through, for one person to get arrested, and I've seen cases where one person, the cops decided to put them through live. And in New York City, that means they get arrested and held for 24 hours. How many salaries and different positions are spent to process one person? You have the cop. Do you know how many hours of overtime a cop gets from making one arrest? You have the paperwork. You have a cop needs their supervisors. Just like thinking about the whole system, right? You need the precinct, you need a cell, you need a place where they're going to be held. All that requires funding. You need a judge in a courtroom with stenographers and lawyers and bailiffs and You need administrative folks on the prosecutor side. My salary is getting paid because I'm reviewing the paperwork that the cops are submitting to me. Each person along the system, and when you cut the job of what that person has to do to simply, oh, let me just review the police paperwork and move it on to the next person and move it on to the next person. People are basically microdosing the detention, the work of the detention of people for the sake of their own salary. System-based solutions will never result in liberatory solutions for our people. And Audre Lorde talked about this all the time, right? The tools, the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. So sorry, I got caught up in that, and I wanted to get to some concrete examples of how we know, but where's my time check?
We are at 12:06, sadly, but let's hear one or two concrete examples, and then we can wrap it up.
Beautiful. So what are we doing? What do we know? The data already shows that less prosecution actually makes us more safe. There was a study of the prosecutor data out of Suffolk County in Boston. First Black prosecutor elected, Rachel Rollins, instituted a declination policy where she refused to, or I can't even say refused. The study is available online. She implemented a policy where she told her line prosecutors that we're no longer going to be prosecuting for a certain number of low-level misdemeanor crimes, including, theft and some, the equivalent of jumping turnstiles, like all like low-level misdemeanors. The policy was presumption to decline, so it was only followed about 30% of the time. But even following it 30% of the time, they were able to show that 5 years later or a couple years later, those folks who were declined to prosecute actually had less interactions in the future, which meant that recidivism was lower. But I like to point out recidivism is, again, a measure created by the system to justify itself, right? We can't go by how the system measures itself. What is recidivism? It's based on an idea of what is crime, and crime is a legal category defined by the people who write the statutes in order to effectuate all the purposes that we already explained. What else do we know? That the vast majority, we want to invoke rapists and as part of the reason why we need jails, the vast majority of people who engage in sexual violence are not actually the people who don't ever get reported. Like, people don't report that stuff. The people don't tend to, it's actually, most people who it's like a very small percentage of people who are actually engaging in sexual abuse ever see the criminal legal system. And in fact, we're putting them in detention centers and in detention where, as we already discussed, there's actually even more sexual abuse and rape. And
we really are going to have to stop. I would love to hear more, but we're a little over time. I think, Mei Li, we have these questions here, but how about, I'd love to hear just even one or two questions from the audience, and you can continue. Maybe the question will prompt further concrete examples. What do you think, Mei Li? Do we have time for a question or two?
Yeah, I'm just going to see if there's anyone in the audience that has a question. No, it doesn't seem so. So we can go to one of the questions you've had prepared. Okay,
just quickly, Jax was getting two solutions toward the end. One of the questions is, can you point to any other countries where alternatives have been adopted that we should consider? So we've painted the picture here. How do we get ourselves out of this? Maybe Audre Lorde is right that maybe we can't, but any other concrete solutions? Jack started to describe a few there. Any more we can add from other countries or just your own research and scholarship?
Yeah, I'm hesitant to point to other countries. I think that the situation we find ourselves in is uniquely American, right? And people often rush to point to these more homogeneous European countries that may not necessarily have histories of colonization, racialized terror, and so forth and so on. So we have to look within, right? We can't go comparing to other countries that don't actually share the same history. And that's what's so important, I think, about the contribution from critical legal studies, critical race theory, and so forth, is that it helps to reconstitute within the study of law the social context and history. Because so often, I think, in practice, attorneys, pursue this program of race neutralization, which is ahistorical, dehumanizing, and we got to get rid of those facets. And I think that's what we can perhaps begin to start, right? Putting the human element back in the law and how we learn about it, and in how we go about practicing it. As I mentioned earlier, as a descendant of slaves with a very distinct history in this country, if we're talking about instituting true justice, then the system must pay attention to all of those facets of who I am and what that lived experience looks like.
Thank you very much. Director Davis or Jax, any follow-up thoughts?
I'll just say really quickly, I think that one of the things that makes it hard for us to draw inspiration from other international examples is that so much of the world has been tainted by Westernist occupation that a lot of our countries and our parents' homelands are still climbing out of the same mentalities that America is steeped in. And so sometimes people like to point to other countries to show similarity and that we're on the right track. But in reality, that is really evidence of them having been tainted by imperialism and not really the other way around. So I would just encourage us, kind of like what Dr. Williams said, this is a uniquely American problem. We've exported it in a lot of ways. America can't keep its hands off Latin America through proxy wars and things. So now they look at our countries and they're like, you guys are all messed up. Okay, thanks. So I guess we do have to look inward. We do have to think creatively, because a lot of times it's easy to dismiss what's happening in other countries. Oh yeah, well sure, things are great there because they have this, they have that, they have high taxes, they have whatever. And it's really easy for people to dismiss the argument. And so we've got to draw inspiration from ourselves, because other countries, the EU is not going to solve our gun violence problem. The EU is not going to solve our incarceration problem. So we can draw inspiration, I think, from some places. But the context in which this system has grown needs to be the first consideration for how we get out of it.
Thank you so much. Excellent. Jax, last word.
Yeah, I'll keep it brief. Daniel Sered did a program called Common Justice, founded Common Justice, which utilized restorative justice, and y'all can look into that. I'm only bringing this up to say that in her work, she wrote about 4 factors that lead to why people engage in violence: exposure to violence, lack of resources, shame, and isolation. So we know that universal health care and access to healthcare and housing is a solution, and people don't understand that violence is iterative. So if people had better conditions, there would be less what is considered crime. Secondly, I would point to Portugal. Portugal decriminalized drugs. The decriminalization of drugs is incredibly important for the survival of our people, because a lot of our people are self-medicating through drugs and then criminalized for it. So if we had the resources that we need in order to not be living in the horrible conditions that our communities are faced and then occupied by police forces, then we would be able to address the conflict as it arises and be preventative. There is not enough emphasis in the United States on preventative things. And so I think that instead of thinking about how do we respond, we need to think about how we prevent and focus on education, deepening community relationships, and being willing to address and look to each other for support when violence occurs, and think about ways in which we can prevent violence. So I'll stop there.
Excellent. Well, we really are out of time. I want to thank all the panelists for really inspiring presentations. Learned a lot, so appreciate it. And we really appreciate your time and your participation in the symposium.
Thanks for having us.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you so much.
And Mei Li, you can take over.
Thank you so much, Professor Johnson and all the panelists. We really appreciated the discussion. Thank you all for joining us for our third panel in total of Symposium and our second panel of today. So for this panel, it's titled Cage Creativity, the Criminalization of Artistic Expression. And as you see, we have Professor Jared Carter as our moderator for this panel. Jared Carter graduated from Vermont Law School in 2009. In addition to serving as an articles editor on the Vermont Journal of Environmental Law, he received an Equal Justice Foundation Fellowship to litigate a constitutional challenge to the U.S. Treasury Department's regulation prohibiting travel to Cuba. Jared also directs the Vermont Community Law Center, litigating constitutional and consumer rights issues in state and federal court. Professor Carter has a wealth of relevant experience and is dedicated to bringing his diverse background to the classroom. He's also an avid outdoors person, backpacking, canoeing, fly fishing in the warmer months, and cross-country skiing in the winter. Despite the fact that Vermont is landlocked, Professor Carter is also enjoys surfing and does so in the frigid waters of the New England coastline. In addition to Professor Carter as a moderator, we also have the following panelists. Professor Kyle Adams, who is Associate Professor of Music Theory at Indiana University in Bloomington, Professor J. Christopher Hamilton of Syracuse University, and the Roy P. Crocker Professor of Law, Professor Jody Amore at the University of California, Los Angeles. Please give them a round of applause.
Great. Appreciate all three of you being here today to talk about this really important topic with the Vermont Law School community, the Vermont Law and Graduate School community. And I think we'd be remiss if we're gonna have a conversation about hip hop and rap and cage creativity to not at least acknowledge the momentous event that happened yesterday with finally, after 27 years, maybe some justice in the murder of Tupac Shakur. And I see Professor Amore in the background there. It looks like you have a plaque or a medallion of some sort. So I'm excited to see that. But I do want to give the panelists just a moment to introduce themselves a little bit more. And so maybe we could just spend a moment or two doing that. And we'll kind of go in order. And I'll just give each of you a real quick from the top introduction and let you all take it away. And then we'll move through a conversation of some questions that I think are really important to this critical topic. So first of all, we have Professor Kyle Adams, who is an associate professor of music theory and the chair of the music theory department at Indiana University, Bloomington. And of course, J. Christopher Hamilton, an attorney, producer, and professor at Syracuse. So love the Syracuse shirt there, with over 20 years of experience in the entertainment industry. And then Professor Jody David Amore, who's the Roy P. Crocker Professor of Law at the University of Southern California. So really excited to have all of you here. Maybe each of you, and we'll kind of just go in that order. Kyle, Professor Hamilton, and Professor Amore, could just briefly introduce yourselves and talk a little bit about how you came to this topic and this issue.
Sure. Thanks all of you for having me here. I'm very much a fish out of water at this symposium. I'm a musician and a classical pianist, and I've been a hip hop head for about 40 years now. And it's my music of choice. I got into the scholarly study of hip hop about 15 years ago, and I published extensively on the analysis of hip hop music. Back in 2015, I was approached by a couple friends / colleagues, criminologist from Northeastern University and a blues scholar from Duke University, to help with a project that they were doing about the use of hip hop lyrics in criminal trials. And what we tried to show in our work was that the use of rap lyrics as evidence, I mean, in addition to all of the troubling implications for free speech and so forth, represented kind of a fundamental misunderstanding of the nature of hip hop lyrics. And we showed that hip hop relied on what we call lyric formulas that stretch all the way back to 1920s blues. And so we analyzed over 16,000 lines of hip hop music and kind of showed what the various themes are that run throughout the music, arguing that hip hop is fundamentally metaphorical in its treatment of violence, and that the lyrics should not be taken literally. This is, of course, long before the Young Thug case, which has gotten a lot of media attention recently. But yeah, that's how I got into it. I love hip hop music, and that's I suppose why I'm here. So thank you very much for having me.
Yeah, Professor Hamilton.
Sorry about that. Yeah, so my background is primarily working in the industry as an entertainment attorney for various movie studios, Lionsgate, Disney, Warner Brothers. But when I started getting invested in the academic side, I really wanted to deconstruct how businesses, these businesses, media companies, movie studios, music labels, and generate revenue, but deconstruct it so that the everyday person can understand how these organizations are able to monetize content, intellectual property. So my focus in this space in particular is more from a business perspective, and also speaking and addressing some of the disconnect between the art, the business, and the legal community. So again, I wrote a paper on how the music industry operates as a criminal cartel, and that's kind of what led me down the pathway of examining rap lyrics being used in criminal trials and exploiting artists under that premise.
Great, thanks. Professor Amor.
Yeah, I've been a hip hop head myself for a long time. I remember leaving my constitutional law class at Berkeley in '87 and walking down Bancroft Way, and there was a frat dorm across the street, and they put the speakers out the window, and I heard a sound I'd never heard before. And lawyers, we're word workers. We're in the language. That's all we do. And I heard word work that was extraordinarily powerful, brutal, and insightful all at once, and I never heard anything like it. And what it was, and I'm going to use, as you can see, my book has the N-word in the title. The rap that we're talking about, especially gangster rap, has a lot of such, transgressive language. So I'm going to use that. That's a trigger warning. But I was walking down the street and I heard, "Fuck the police," coming straight from the underground. A young nigga got it bad because I'm brown and not the other color, so police think they have the authority to kill a minority. That was searing social commentary. It was brutal. It was profane and profound. I kept listening to it. Then later, I saw Cube break out on his own with America's Most Wanted, and then after that, Nas and Jay-Z. And I heard a music that was not only very eloquent, but also very political in its nature. And, I started kind of following it then. I've been up here in this space that I'm in now in LA, in this room that I'm in, for the last 15 years. I've met with Layla Steinberg group. She's been holding microphone sessions, and microphone sessions, that's where she really first ran across Tupac and became his manager, his first manager. Rappers are given, themes to write on each week, and then they come together and perform on those themes. She's currently representing Earl Sweatshirt. A lot of people have come through this particular space and, wrap their minds and our hearts around rap as a way of enhancing emotional intelligence, political solidarity, political insight, and the like. And finally, I did a play over at SC about 10 years ago called Race, Rap, and Redemption, in which the call of the question for the evening was, should we pour liquor for Tukey? Should we express ritualistic, a solidarity through a libation ceremony for a killer who co-founded the Crips? And I knew that I wasn't going to reach that audience making that closing argument to them, 1,100 students, with just some lawyerly arguments. I knew art was going to have to be there. So I brought in art. We had Nas and Quan doing Just a Moment. We had Cube doing his work, Lupe Fiasco doing his work, Lula Washington Dance Company doing a modern dance to Tupac Shakur's Brenda's Got a Baby. I asked if that baby that Brenda had before she was killed was Stanley Tukey Williams. How would we judge him? By the end of that night, and you can see this on YouTube, you had 1,100 students standing up, and faculty and staff, with their lighters in the air to Tukey Williams, because that's the power of art. That's the power of this art. And so that's how I got into it.
That's really interesting. I mean, can any of you think of other sort of non-rap lyric creative expressions that have had similar outcomes or have been used in similar ways, whether in cases or otherwise, or do you feel like it's really pretty much limited to this type of expression in art? And Kyle, maybe we'll start with you.
No, I mean, I can't think of any. Well, certainly no musical genres One of the points that we made in our article was that if this were applied to other genres, of course, country musicians would be in jail all the time, as would people who write librettos for opera. I mean, opera is misogynistic, it's violent, there's always murder, and so it has all of the same themes that hip hop lyrics have. And so to not see a kind of racial component to that, I think, is to be willfully blind, in my opinion. One thing that occurred to me is that it's not just lyrics, though, it's images as well. One of the most tragic cases that I learned about was Draco the Ruler, the young man who was accused of murder simply because he happened to be where a murder took place. And really the prosecutor had it out for him, but they were the main, in addition to his lyrics, the main piece of evidence, quote unquote, against Draco was that a gun that he used in one of his videos was the same type as a gun that was used in this murder, and so that was considered, damning evidence in his case. So I think, and I'm surprised we haven't seen more of that. That the images that rappers use would also be would be used against them. That's the only case that I know of, specifically something non-lyrical that was used, though.
Yeah, others want to chime in on that, or thoughts? I think you're still muted.
Apologies. Yeah, I would just want to add to that. There are hundreds of cases where obviously it's been used in the rap context and with rappers. It's ironic that it hasn't appeared, at least not to the degree where it's noteworthy or we've become aware of it outside of hip hop music. I mean, so I think that in of itself is a statement, really, like Kyle I just shared a moment ago.
Yeah, I thought about this, Jared. And dug a little bit. I didn't have time to dig as much as I would have liked, but I ran across a couple cases, not lyrics. I'm thinking of the Cameron Todd Willingham case, which was touted by many death penalty abolitionists as a factually innocent person, a case of factually innocent person being executed, one of the clearest cases in modern times. And Willingham was a white male convicted and executed for intentionally setting a house on fire and killing the children inside. At his trial, a psychologist who'd never met Willingham and had never published research in the area of sociopathic behavior, nevertheless testified that Willingham was a sociopath based in part on heavy metal posters Willingham had on his walls. The psychologist used Willingham's Iron Maiden and Led Zeppelin posters to conclude, quote, many times individuals that have a lot of this type of art have interest in satanic type activities, unquote, right? And I also looked at, kind of Insane Clown Posse, which is another rap group composed of white members, and the FBI designated fans of Insane Clown Posse as a gang in the National Gang Threat Assessment Report. And so, those are a couple, and of course, Johnny Cash saying, I shot a man in Reno just to watch him die, kind of thing. But yeah, by far, it is going after Black artists.
Yeah, so there seems to be a real disparate impact that we're talking about here. And in fact, for the folks joining us here from Vermont, I think oftentimes we think of this as something happening far away, and in fact, there's a pretty strong hip hop scene in Vermont. There was just recently a case in which an individual who had made a rap video sort of parodying hunting culture in Vermont was being charged with a crime, and they played his rap video during his bail hearing to show that the person who he was going to be released to, if he was released on bail, was not a responsible adult because he made an appearance in this, this rap video of a bunch of guys wearing orange vests and running around with hunting rifles in the woods as part of the lyrics. And it really struck me as the prevalence of this, even in places like Vermont. And so I guess the question is, and I think it's probably obvious, but I'd love to hear y'all's take on it. Like where we have artists, we have rappers who are known for making silly songs or parodies or saying outrageous things. Can we take their words as true, or is the art is this an art form that obviously we can't take as true and therefore probably shouldn't be using in the court of law?
Yeah,
and maybe go ahead.
I'll jump in there. I mean, look, I think that it's all relative, and unfortunately, I don't think it could be described in such black and white terms in the context of real, when there are real stakes and real issues at play. I mean, look, I'm sure we all can think of or have heard of or encountered some individual who was a more or less a full-time criminal, but happened to have a hobby, writing down rap lyrics and making videos, or others who literally have one foot in both worlds. So I would say this. I'd say, if anyone is going to use, lyrical expression to cloak, hide, or promote, unlawful acts, then you're going to find yourselves in the crosshairs of the law because you're making it easy. You're literally just confessing, snitching, quote unquote, snitching on yourself. Now, whether that should be used against you in a court of law, that's another conversation we're going to obviously have. But I do feel as though that, watch what you say because you could be held accountable for it.
I'll jump in here. I mean, I certainly agree. It's one of those things where if you're going to flaunt something in front of the law, then unfortunately you're taking a risk that the law is going to pick up on it. I mean, I wish it were at least applied across the board to musicians from all genres and all races. I think that's one of the big problems here. I don't know if you all have seen that there's a pretty well-known Key and Peele sketch where Jordan Peele plays a gangster rapper and he's being held in a holding cell or whatever, being interrogated by the cop, and everything he says on the tape is something, I don't know, I'm not describing it very well, but it's very clear that his lyrics are an exact replication of what happened in the crime and what he's going to say if he's ever interrogated. And it kind of makes fun of the whole thing. Like, yeah, obviously sometimes rappers are actually saying what they're literally doing, and they need to watch out there. I often think of the scholar Trisha Rose, who's one of the great hip hop scholars of my generation. She talks about what she calls the pretense of no pretense. And I think that's what gets a lot of these rappers in trouble, is because, when you had people like, Professor Armour mentioned Ice Cube and NWA a while back. I mean, they were pretty clear from the beginning that they were representing in their lyrics their lived experiences, but that those were, no longer their lived experiences. They were rapping about the way that conditions were. But now you have, it's almost, as a rapper, I think people feel that they have to develop their credibility by talking about life in the streets and violence and murder and all kinds of criminal activity. In the same way that if you're Taylor Swift, you're not going to make her early songs were not about growing up as the wealthy daughter of a hedge fund manager in Pennsylvania. She put on the pretense of being a country artist. And I think a lot of young rappers feel they need to sort of maintain that fictitious connection to, quote unquote, the streets in order to get some credibility. I would, to answer your question, Jared, sorry, I kind of got off on a tangent there, but to answer your question of whether lyrics can ever be taken as true, I'm not a lawyer or a legal scholar, but I would be reluctant to ever do that in the absence of any other concrete evidence. And I think that's what bothers me about so many of these cases, at least the ones that I've studied, that there's literally no other evidence that they're going on other than the lyrics. And that I think is really troubling.
I agree. I may have a slightly different take on this, and that is, Jay-Z, Hov, I don't know there's a single song that I've heard by him where he doesn't talk about his life as a drug dealer. He references it in about every song. That's his brand. He comes in, I was in the kitchen, cooking up the crack and making a lot of references to that. And even when he was becoming successful, he says, hey, compare the money I'm making in rap with the money I'm still making, slinging crack. And, he's probably one of the most successful musicians in music history. I mean, he had at one time, he was up to 13 #1 albums in a row. Only the Beatles were ahead of him. He left people like Stevie Wonder, anybody you can name, Rolling Stones, all of them behind the dust, right? With that same message, that same kind of brand. And it was a powerful brand because he'd always say, what I'm doing was made possible by Iran-Contra, by Oliver North, by, I'm part of your foreign policy, and And so, you know, don't look at me as some kind of just monster and demon. And he humanized for many people. You know, he penetrated pop culture, went into suburban bedrooms and humanized people that they were demonizing on the television. They were demonizing in the press in all kinds of ways and saying, here's my narrative, here's an alternative take. And right now out here in California, you know, slinging, for example, marijuana, cannabis, weed, I can't go around to any Tony shop in Brentwood or anywhere else and not pass 3 or 4 boutique marijuana, you know, shops who are doing, you know, what he was talking about doing illegal, what was quote unquote illegal back then, making it clear that these are mala prohibited crimes, not mala in se kind of crimes going in. And finally, I just go to one more time, and I'm sorry, you know, like I said, my book is largely rooted in gangster rap. That's why the N is in the title. You know, gangster rappers were N-word virtuosos. They introduced N-words to the N-word to music and popular culture like virtually nobody else. You know, Last Poets, a few others, you know, Richard Pryor, but they really did it. And is this, you know, this is just when Q broke out. When I recited this at an American Law School Association annual conference in 1999, never got invited back for about 20 years when I did it. But I was saying, you know, the words of the prophets used to be written on the subway walls and tenement halls. Now they're coming out of these boom boxes with lyrics like, okay, here we go. I heard payback's a motherfucking nigga. That's why I'm tired of getting treated like goddamn stepchild. Fuck a punk cause I ain't him. You gotta deal with the 9 double M. The day is coming that you all hate. Just think if niggas decide to retaliate. They try to keep me from running up. I never tell you to get down. It's all about coming up. So what they do, go and ban the AK. My shit wasn't registered any fucking way. So you better duck away, run and hide out when I'm rolling real slow with the lights out. Cause I'm about to fuck up the program, shooting out the window of a drop top Broham. Well, I'm shooting, let's see who dropped, the police, the media, suckers at one pop. Motherfuckers that say they're too black, put them overseas, they'll be begging to come back. They say keep them off guns and drugs. You want to sweep a nigga like me up under the rug, kicking shit called street knowledge. Why more niggas in the pen than in college? Because of that line, I must be your cellmate. That's from the nigga you love to hate. Should he been locked up for those lyrics?
No,
I think we might have to. That was pretty impressive, actually. I gotta say. I was gonna start like trying to beatbox behind you there, but I guess the thing that I think about that I keep coming back to, and as I'm hearing you guys talk about it, I think it just keeps reiterating this to me, is sort of art throughout history, to my mind, has always often, or almost always been, not always, but often been about shining a light on some problem in society without, you know, necessarily actually doing that. And I guess the concern I have is if we start to disincentivize, or if we have a legal system that makes people essentially self-censor about what they're going to say, what they're going to rap about, because they're worried that it might come back to haunt them in a prosecution, then I think that has a real impact on society's ability to self-reflect. Professor Amor, you talked about, you know, humanizing and bringing this into the, you know, the living rooms of a broader American society. And so if that ability to sort of shine that light there is impacted negatively, then I have real concerns about it. And I don't know if you all have thoughts on that, or have sort of seen cases where this has come up in your professional work, Professor Hambleton, in your work. I'm not sure if you've seen anything like that, but
yeah, I just want to highlight something here, and I appreciate my co-panelists in their efforts to do this, which is, you know, pull out and look at this on a macro level, right? Because, you know, it's interesting to discuss this issue within the context of high-profile rappers and really compelling rap lyrics and social commentary, but I think if we were to look at it from the large perspective and kind of look at what's going on, which is basically our criminal justice system doing what it always does best, which is go after the low-hanging fruit, right? Go, you know, basically pick on the little guy, quote unquote. Make it easy to build cases against people. And again, I'm not speaking of the handful of like uber successful rappers, but the vast majority of the people who would consider themselves at the bottom of the rung, underclass, quote unquote, in the streets trying to make it and also rap at the same time. And I think if we want to highlight, I think highlighting that is important, because just like we're highlighting Iran-Contra and all of these instances where, quote unquote, the state is basically doing what it's doing on this side of the table, while and by holding us accountable, quote unquote, us or individuals who are ensnared in the criminal some of these criminal enterprises, or the implications of them, and pulling us out down on that side of the table. So my point is that I think this is great as a conversation, but I would love the larger society to look at the bigger implications, what we're really talking about. Prosecutors making their careers on the backs of individuals who really don't have the wherewithal or resources to defend themselves, and we're going to get into this eventually, I guess, but the idea that circumstantial evidence, right, real circumstantial evidence compounded with inflammatory evidence, which is these rap lyrics, in it being the thing that ends up hanging the noose around someone's neck and putting them in prison for life or over 10, 20 years or death penalty. Like, it's insane when you think about on that level. So it's really it's exploitive and on an obvious level, but I think it's a indicator of a much bigger issue when it's this predatory policing element to it, which has obviously racialized in particular with this particular issue.
Yeah, that reminds me of a case that one of the ones that I turned up, which was one of the more disturbing ones. A rapper named Clyde, his real name was Clyde Smith. He went by G-Red. I believe he was from Louisiana, but I could be wrong about that. But I think this is partly what Professor Hamilton's talking about. That this is a minor, a rapper nobody's ever heard of ever, but he rapped about dealing drugs in his lyrics, and he got pulled over by the cops. He had some prescription bottles in his car, and he had legally acquired, he had prescriptions for all of the drugs in his possession. He had medical conditions justifying their use, and there were no pills missing from any of the bottles. But based on his lyrics, he was convicted and sentenced to 30 years in prison, and I think his appeal was denied in 2018. And that, I think this is more the kind of thing. It's true, that you have the Jay-Z's and the Ice Cubes. And yeah, NWA got in a lot of trouble with the FBI, back in 88, 89, but they're so big, they're never going to face any real consequences. But I think where this problem is most insidious is at that level of the young up and coming rapper, or somebody who's just trying to kind of make it by, and getting harassed by the police and sort of, and put away because of their lyrics. So yeah, I would agree. It's that the sort of street level or the micro level is in a certain way where it's the most dangerous.
I'm sorry, I don't cut off Professor Moore.
No, I'm finished.
I just wanted to add one other point to that, which I think is also a tactic, right? So we have the attempt to go after the low-level dealers, or the people who can't defend themselves, and then again the luminaries more or less have the resources to defend themselves against these. But then there's this element of the RICO dragnet, right? So for example, the Young Thug case, where I don't know how much prosecutors really care about Young Thug, but he might be their entree into the wider criminal enterprise or the criminal organizations that were plaguing Atlanta, Georgia. So the idea being that, yeah, so Young Thug, he's a big rapper. Let's assume he's innocent, but he's spending time with people in the street who are known felons, known criminals. Why don't we, if I'm a prosecutor, why don't we target him as a means to get to them? And he's the conduit into that space. Let's use RICO. So I just wanted to add that commentary.
Yeah, and I need to agree with my two colleagues that it's really the less known that the burden of these prosecutions are falling on. But I also want to complicate it a little bit in terms of thinking about the racism and how much of this is just about racism. I of course think a lot of it is, but recognize how many of these prosecutors themselves are Black. The one out here prosecuting Draco and persecuting him for so many years, Jackie Lacey, that was a Black woman. In Atlanta, that's a Black woman. And you have Black politicians and people in the Black community supporting that, coming from a politics of respectability kind of perspective. Don't confuse them with me. We got to sharply distinguish between, bad Negroes and good Negroes. Part of the reason for my title is Chris Rock launched his comedic career in '97 with a routine called Bring the Pain, in which he went back and forth in front of a black audience in DC, Chocolate City, and he said this was the line that he used over and over. Like a civil war going on in Black America, there's two sides. There's black people and there are N-words. And nigga has got to go. I love black people, but I hate N-word. Boy, I wish they'd let me join the Ku Klux Klan. I'd do a drive-by from here to Brooklyn. And he went on like that for 20 minutes, and his core definition of a so-called N-word was a black criminal, right? So really wrapping his arms around the politics of respectability and shining a light on the fact that many members in the black community too are also attacking these same artists, you know, and saying, oh, you are dispensing, you know, you're promoting, you are encouraging bad, you know, and things that hurt our racial reputation. You know, our racial reputation is important, and you're tarnishing it, and that sort of thing. So it complicates this when you bring in the class dynamic as well as the racial dynamic, and as sources of attack on rap.
Yeah, no, those are really great points, and as we sort of segue into that space of what can be used, what can't be used, when should or when would it be appropriate to use artistic expression in, say, a criminal trial? I'd be curious to hear what you all think. I mean, are there instances where a rap lyric, or quite frankly any creative expression, should be admissible as evidence, do you think, or would your position sort of be it just should never be used because of its importance as artistic expression? And maybe we'll start with you, Professor Adams.
Okay, I might be the least qualified person to talk about that. I guess this one of the cases I'm thinking of doesn't involve an actual criminal trial. So, I'm not. The rapper's name was T Bizzle. I don't remember his given name, but he was a high schooler in Mississippi, and he learned. This is a very high-profile case. I remember people like Killer Mike from Run the Jewels got involved, and a lot of people were advocating on behalf of this kid. But he found out that some of the athletic coaches at his school were making sexual advances on some of the students, on some of the female students. And he went home and he wrote a rap about it and put it up on YouTube. And the rap, I mean, it's objectively an absolutely terrible rap song. It's exactly what you'd expect from a 15-year-old kid. But in the song, he makes some pretty explicit threats against the coaches. And so he was pulled out of school. I think he was transferred. And one of the and I'll leave it again to the lawyers and legal scholars here to say what the difference is here with a case that's a minor, and it's the school system. But I think the argument that was made there was that he was making concrete threats against a school, and that's a different kettle of fish than abstract kind of vague threats against other rappers, or the kind of things that adult rap stars do. And so it was kind of an absurd case. Because clearly these were metaphorical threats of violence against school coaches, both of whom, by the way, never had faced any consequences, even though they were accused of sexual misconduct with minors. But this is the kind of thing where I could see maybe at the outside a sort of concrete threat against a school or a place where minors are. I still wouldn't call that evidence in the absence of any other evidence. But I could see that being a window into, maybe we should investigate something like this further.
Yeah, I would just add that. So, okay, essentially, introducing rap lyrics is introducing evidence into a trial, right? And normally speaking, not normally, pursuant to the law, you can't introduce evidence that of a defendant's quote unquote bad character. You can't introduce character evidence in this regard. It has to be probative in some kind of way and speak to and relevant to the motive or the intent. But the prosecutors know what they're doing when they introduce these lyrics. They know that it's going to trigger the stereotype, right, what the jury or the judge might perceive as a stereotype of this particular defendant by playing music that incorporates, murders, killings, thuggery, right? So again, it's supposed to be excluded if it's not probative, right? It's to intent or to or to motive, but it's often not. And it's also supposed to be excluded if it is prejudicial. But obviously, it's been admitted and not considered prejudicial. I think one of the ironies of this is that, and I forget which of my co-panelists mentioned this, but we prosecutors are responsible. I mean, prosecutors of color, Black in particular, are responsible for introducing this kind of very damaging and prejudicial content in a trial. But the irony is that the juries and the judges are the ones that ultimately bring about the outcome of that case in terms of how they interpret that evidence. And most of the juries, right, are not of our peers, especially in the case of marginalized communities. So when individuals hear, whether it's a bail hearing, whether it's a sentencing hearing, whether it's a trial, hear thuggery and the most destructive language being used, and then they look at the person sitting there as a defendant, and it matches up with their perception of what this person would be like, even though it has nothing to do with the actual crime or their intent. They assume this person must have carried on this behavior. I'll add one last thing, and I want to move on. There are a couple of attempts at changing the legislation, and particularly in New York, so that rap lyrics will be excluded. But California was the most progressive up to this point, where they have incorporated new evidentiary rules to better yet protect creative expression. And I'm just going to read to you what they have is that the prosecutor must show that the evidence is that the probative value of the creative expression is minimal, right? So in addition, the probative value cannot be considered minimal if it's near the time of the charged crime, bears a sufficient level of similarity to the crime, or includes a factual detail not otherwise publicly available. So, and they also have to show that the evidence isn't prejudicial. So again, so California, I guess, is on the frontier here, or the cutting edge when it comes to protecting creative expression in these contexts, but no other court really is. And again, New York has yet been able to pass legislation. It's still in the House, I think, or the Assembly, for been that way for a couple of years now. That would stipulate that this evidence would be excluded. So that's my 2 cents on that one.
Yeah, and there are two different ways you see rap lyrics being brought up. One is rap lyrics are autobiographical, the claim that they're autobiographical, that this is somebody's diary. Oftentimes they aren't even performing it. They're just finding it, some rap lyrics someone wrote in a book, right, or in a notepad, and they're bringing those into trial. Or sometimes they're even performing some other rapper's lyrics, and they bring that into the trial. But as somehow autobiographical or diary that's an accurate reflection of their reality and their lives, that's one way they've used it. And then as Professor Adams was pointing out as well, the other way you see it coming up is as threats, right? Not as autobiographical, but as threats. And in that case, the words themselves, those words, they're the evidence. That's kind of, you don't need additional evidence. That's the evidence. The threats in the language. Alonus, is a famous case. Went up to the Supreme Court, and unfortunately, the Supreme Court said, no, you can't quite use it the way you did here. You have to get into intent more seriously. So in both those cases, I think, man, it's a tough one for me in some ways, because I want a blanket prohibition, frankly. That's what my intuition tells me on the one hand. On the other, I know that's going to be a hard sell. That's going to be the hardest sell. So to make it more palatable to the public and politicians, what Professor Hamilton was pointing out, something that is kind of tailored and surgically, you try to limit the amount of damage that can be done by admitting these lyrics, maybe drawing some distinction between using it autobiographically versus in a threat way. If you're giving someone's address, you're doxing them, and making, other kinds of threats. I'm more sympathetic to that right now, if there has to be an exception versus the more autobiographical, but it is a tough issue.
Well, and I think those are all really well received points. And the Alanis case, I think, was a really interesting one in a lot of ways. And it did give the Supreme Court the chance to decide once and for all, like, what's the test when it comes to threatening in artistic expression. And there were hundreds of amicus briefs on it. In the end, right, the Supreme Court didn't actually decide that First Amendment issue, and they punted. But just this past term, there was a case that they decided, Counterman v. Colorado, that looked at when you could prosecute someone for threatening language. And interestingly, the court, I think in many ways perhaps would be well received by the panel and by members of the audience, but the court said you can't just say, well, this was threatening the individual, and if an objectively reasonable person would view that as a threat, that's enough, and you can criminalize. The court said you actually have to prove some level of subjective intent by the speaker, and so I think that does provide some level of protection against the use of rap lyrics to prosecute. They actually have to show that the artist intended or was reckless with their lyrics and in terms of that threat. So I think that's an important sort of protection. But beyond that, I'm a little bit concerned, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this from the panel, that the standards are the standards are vague, right? So the Supreme Court said you can't use them to prosecute someone for their abstract beliefs or for showing membership in a group. But what exactly does that mean? And I guess my concern is that prosecutors, I think, as someone said earlier, know this and are going to use that vague sort of standard to their advantage to try to get this in, and courts generally go along. And I don't know if in your experience, Professor Adams, in your research, you came across instances like that, but or have any thoughts on it. But I'd love to see what folks think about that.
I don't know. I don't have any specific thoughts about the issue that you're bringing up. I mean, I think one of the other dangerous things is that, and I think this plays out a little bit in the Young Thug case, which again, I would leave this to the experts, the legal experts, to talk about that a little bit more. But the idea of whether or not the lyrics are making explicit threats or are autobiographical, the idea that any group of young men, especially young black men, constitutes a gang. This is exactly what happened in the Draco case too, because they argued that his posse, which he called the Stink Team, was a gang. And my understanding of that is, my limited understanding is that then opens up some doors to the prosecution to start doing some things. I mean, he spent 3 years in solitary confinement, never actually being convicted of anything. All because he was supposedly a member of participating in gang activity when this murder took place, which was not true. Even the friends of the guy that got murdered said that Draco's group was not a gang. But I think that's one tactic. It seems like a bit of a left-handed or backdoor way to skirt around the issue of the actual lyrics. That's my 2 cents on it.
Any other thoughts?
So on that particular case, not necessarily because I'm not as familiar with it, but I think that and this was mentioned earlier, the dilemma that hip hop artists, particularly ones that have music more on the lean to the gangster music, it's like this idea that in order for them to be successful, we or the audience has to believe that what they're saying is true, right? But if what they're saying has any truth to it, therein lies the problem for them being exposed to criminal prosecution. So it's and then I guess on an even larger scale, what responsibility does the organizations funding and financing their music have in this case, right? So, for example, again, I don't have all the particulars of Young Thug's case, but I know some of the details, the guns, the drugs. But if 300, his label, or the parent that owns it, I think Warner, is fully aware of his association with unsavory criminal types, but yet and still they decide to fund a music video and an album including some of these people in the content and referencing some of the crimes that have taken place. And they would know some of that to be true because of things that Doug has said in interviews and with other people. I feel like it's a perfectly baked cake for, the indictments and the RICO charges, right? So, but how do you, as an artist, leverage that street credibility by having a clean image? It doesn't work that way. So you can't. So if you want to be a gangster rapper, you have to obviously be tied in with gangsters and criminals, even if you're not committing those crimes. But then all of a sudden you get caught up in the dragnet, and then when it comes time, when the indictments come down and the RICO charges come down, everyone that lent you aid, every business partner, every legitimate stakeholder steps away and say, "Oh, that's not my problem. I just gave you $300,000 for the video and another $500,000 for the album, and I knew you did but I don't have nothing to do with this." It's just a very, the irony is almost comical, and it's a Greek tragedy. It's crazy.
Yeah, as Professor Hamilton is pointing out, authenticity matters a lot. It's a touchstone, right? People are always talking about who's real and who ain't. How authentic are you? And are you just pretending to be some? Are you cosplaying out here, or are you telling something that's real? And so, yeah, that's why I lean more towards, at least if it's autobiographical, something more of a blanket protection. I like your point, Professor Carter, about the mens rea approach to protecting some of these threat cases, right? Requiring a high mens rea of intent or maybe recklessness, but I worry about recklessness because now you're getting into an area that's vaguer. I like the intent approach even better as a free speech protection. But it makes me wonder: is it better to look at these cases as free speech cases with a racial dimension, or as racial cases with a free speech dimension, right? I ran across, I think, my friend Eric Nielsen. He has a book out, Rap on Trial, in which he talks a little bit about this. I think he makes a good point that in that book that, you could look at these as free speech cases in which, you're telling other audiences, look, the rappers are the canary in the mine. They're going after rappers now, but they're pretty soon going to be coming after your free speech, your free artistic expression, But then, as he points out, that's not really happening. They're not going after those other forms of art. They aren't going, it's not spreading out like that. So it looks more like racially motivated cases with a free speech dimension. It's really targeting Black artists and socially marginalized artists, and has some free speech dimension to be sure, but not primarily of that kind. And that helped me when I was reading his book. It was a helpful insight.
Yeah, no, it's a fascinating book, and I think there's a lot of great resources that they've put together particularly on the legal angle and the First Amendment. And I guess I just keep coming back to, right, our system is set up. We're supposed to you prosecute acts. You don't prosecute thoughts or speech. And political commentary, in particular, political speech, receives some of the most, is the most protected speech. And interestingly, the U.S. Supreme Court recently, actually in a case just this past term, I think really honed in on artistic expression in a completely different context. But I wonder if maybe the U.S. Supreme Court would be interested in these sorts of arguments now in that artistic expression realm. And so I'd love to hear you all's thoughts. I mean, do you think the strategy to fix this is litigation? Is it legislation like California and maybe what New York's trying to do? I mean, how do we get at this problem?
Can I just add one thing to this before we answer the question? Sure. I think this idea, this prospect of, old white men. No offense to anyone who considers themselves an old white man, but who are from a totally different world can appreciate the creative expression of young Black men and women in the ghettos throughout our country, or can recognize the political version of that expression, right? So I think therein lies somewhat of a hurdle is this disconnect with not just the content, but as well as the context. And then we get into and we see this, I mean, again, looking at it macro, we've seen this double standard throughout our entire society, where we looked at the draconian drug laws, right? You know, you get 10 years for crack, you get 2 years for cocaine, powder cocaine. Like we're you know, and then we look at the Iran-Contra or the housing meltdown. Like the individuals with the resources, you know, with the political alliances, with all of the clout, are usually not people who look like the rappers in the inner city, and they're the ones that get away with it. And so whether we take whether the path to protection is legislation or some other means, I do think it's going to be important that people understand, and even if they don't agree, but understand what these issues are. And I think oftentimes there's an emotional block or a cognitive dissonance with what the reality is for these individuals. So it's easy to paint them as criminals or people who want to be criminals versus, you know, young men and women who are actually, you know, freedom fighters or advocates for change.
Can I jump in on that too? You know, you posed a kind of dichotomy there, Professor Carter, with you know, is the answer litigation or legislation? I mean, partly the answer is education. And this is, you know, what the work that I've been trying to do is sort of translational. It's to say that, you know, we have to understand these rap lyrics in the context of the communities in which they were created, in the context of the tradition of African American lyrics going back, you know, again, 100, 150 years. And I think this is, to touch on what Professor Hamilton was saying, it's exactly right. Like part of the problem is just a lack of understanding of the goals and the context and the background of hip hop artists. I mean, I think about, you know, when Professor Armour said at the beginning, when Fuck the Police came out, you know, I was a 12-year-old white kid in suburbia, and in a certain way, I was the target market for that music. And what I saw happening around me were two different kinds of reactions. There was the reaction that I had, and fortunately my family had, which was like, holy shit, this is happening. Like I had no idea this was going on. This is horrible. And then the reaction of a lot of other white people were like, oh, look at these guys are just criminals and they're thugs and they're, you know, they're completely useless members of society. So I don't know what the concrete answer is here, but I think just a lot of sort of translational educational work about what hip hop music is still necessary these days.
You know, I think it's real interesting. You know, I like the way you're going, Professor Carter, in distinguishing between political speech and maybe artistic expression. The most robust protections are for political speech. And my view of this art form has always been that it is profoundly political, you know, and political doesn't mean, a speech can be political without saying, go to the ballot box. You know, political speech is, you know, about us, them, right? The heart of politics is an us-them distinction, solidarity, rallying people, unifying people around an alternative vision of justice, of social justice, of personhood, and that sort of thing, and challenging, you know, drug laws, challenging how we criminalize some activities and not others, you know. So I'm really interested in exploring that distinction more and trying to get the court and lawmakers to see the political dimensions of this art form that they might otherwise just view as pure entertainment, pure artistic expression, without, you know, the substance of political spirit that they feel more solicitous of.
Yeah, no, that's interesting, and it almost seems like it's this vicious cycle in a way, because if you set up a system in which people are, you know, perhaps self-censoring, not willing to speak about these things in that artistic expression, can you even do that education? Can you you know, use that as a method of persuasion? And it almost seems like it's just this vicious circle. But I am interested in, like, sort of, yeah, how do the two sort of channels fit together? Because artistic expression is also highly protected by the First Amendment, and I wonder if, you know, that lane works perhaps would be as effective with the current Supreme Court as, say, the political speech. So we've got about 10-12 minutes left. I guess last question. Well, two questions for each of you. The greatest rapper to ever do it, and I know that's a tough one. It's the hardest question of the day. And where do we go from here? I mean, what would you hope to accomplish? What would you say to law students at a place like Vermont Law School if this was an issue that they wanted to be involved in? And maybe we could do that in a couple of minutes and then leave the last 10 minutes for question and answer.
Well, I'll just say real quickly, my Mount Rushmore of rappers is Pac, Nas, Hove, and Cube. I'm just saying, and I have to throw in Public Enemy. I'm sorry, but they're not coming from kind of the personal narrative. I was in there actually being somewhat critical of those folks. I've had Chuck D over a number of times to the school, et cetera. They were talking about Night of the Living Bassheads and being critical of the guys who are pushing, kind of the drug dealer narrative, right, on the one hand. So that'd be my Mount Rushmore. And, this is real hard. Pick your favorite kid, kind of thing. I got 3 boys, pick my favorite boy, But, I used to not be a big Hove fan, because he wasn't as political as Nas. He wasn't political as Cube, P.E., even Tupac, But just the sheer success, just the bam, 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 every year. For a while back there, every year, bam, 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 he brought me around. I'm not going to say he's the greatest, but he's right up there. That's all I'm going to say.
All right, fair enough.
I like the Mount Rushmore idea. I'm not picking a single one, but definitely Chuck D, Q-Tip, MF Doom for me, and fourth one. Actually, I'd give it to Killer Mike from Run the Jewels. I don't listen to much modern rap, but they're carrying the torch for the kind of socio-political rap that I grew up with. But Ice Cube would be a very, very close fifth. I might swap him out for one of those.
So mine, Jay-Z, who did get very political of recent with his music. Nas, 100%, definitely the first couple of albums. I mean, he painted such vivid worlds where he came from. Actually, Raekwon the Chef from Wu-Tang Clan. And my last would be Black Thought from the Roots.
Awesome. Appreciate those are pretty good lists. All right. So then I guess why don't we have about 10 minutes. So maybe we'll on that note, we'll leave it there and let students, if they have them, ask any questions or other participants if of the panelists. So open it up for questions.
Hey, thank all y'all very much. This has been an awesome talk. Professor Carter, this question is specifically for you. Who is your Mount Rushmore of rappers?
Tupac Amaru Shakur. Absolutely, no questions asked. For all of the reasons everybody else stated about everybody, and I think he honestly, I would he was part of the reason I went to law school. If funny enough, and I grew up in the woods of Maine, listening to his music, and that reality, that political speech, that shining the light on society and those difficulties was really an inspiration to me, and a big part of the reason I went to law school in the first place was to find a place where I could hopefully participate in making the world a better place. And interestingly, I was a super nerd, and I back when I used Instagram, I Instagram messaged Napoleon, who was one of the outlaws, who's now lives in Saudi Arabia, telling him that story. And I actually got a response back from him saying, "Hey, great story, bro. Love to hear it." And so absolutely, Tupac, no question about it.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah.
While we got a minute here, I'm going to show you something that's related to our Mount Rushmore of rappers. Can you see that typewriter there? See that typewriter? That's the typewriter my dad used to type his way out of prison. He was given 22 to 55 for possession and sale of marijuana, and he had to teach himself the law, wrote his own writs of habeas corpus, represented himself pro se through the state and federal system, wound up in the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals in a case called Armour versus Salisbury, prevailing saying it was the denial of a defendant's due process for the prosecutor to intentionally lie to the jury to get a conviction. And what really first turned me on to rap and got me deep into rap was not the gangster rappers, it was Public Enemy. When I heard that song, Black Steel and Our Chaos, it was his story. You know, I got a letter from the government the other day. I opened and read it. Said they were suckers. They wanted me for the army or whatever. Picture me giving a damn. I said, never. Here's a land that never gave a damn about a brother like me and myself because they never did. I wasn't with it, but just that very minute it occurred to me the suckers had authority. Cold sweating, here he is. Cold sweating as I dwell in my cell. How long has it been? They got me sitting in a state pen. I got to get out, but that thought was thought before. I contemplated a plan on the cell floor. That was what he was doing with that typewriter on the cell floor, tick-tacking away. And that's what got me into it.
That's great. All right, so maybe I don't know if there's other questions from students, but I guess I would tie back to remember I had a two-part question. It wasn't just who is your Mount Rushmore, but what advice would you have for students who are interested in this issue or interested in being, involved in these sorts of things moving forward? And maybe we'll start Professor Hamilton. How about that?
Yeah, I was going to say, I would say, don't be intimidated by, being one of the only voices or a lone voice speaking to power and trying to affect change. And I would also say find, don't do it alone. Find people who are of like-mindedness and work together, whether it's in a courtroom, in a boardroom, on a platform, trying to affect political change. But I do think it takes a lot of courage, and I think you can do it. But you have to be, intentional, and then try not to be alone.
Great, Professor.
To me, it's all. Yeah, I mean, I'm not a lawyer or a legal scholar, but I mean, to me, it's all about familiarity with the music, listening to as much hip hop as you can. The way that you arm yourself is with knowledge. And with understanding, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, of just the context and the history of this music, and the reasons that people are saying the things that they're saying.
Yeah, Professor Moore.
Yeah, this is struggle music in a lot of ways. It's resistance music, and viewing it as such, getting involved with it, as my co-panelist said, getting together with others to embrace the spirit of it. It's now the most popular music in the world, right? In terms of sales and just straight up sales, it's eclipsed all the other art forms, hip hop, with the driving edge of rap. I remember a couple years ago when it surpassed all of those, and there was a lot of news stories about it. So yeah, embracing, and especially, I would just say this, as law students, I tell my law students all the time, there are 4 occupations in America whose bread and butter is word work. They live or die on the basis of the word work they do, right? What they can do with language. And that would be writers, poets, lawyers, and rappers, right? And so recognizing, the word, Toni Morrison said, we die, that may be the meaning of life, but we do language, that may be the measure of our lives. Recognizing the kinship between rappers and lawyers, that we're all laboring in the same linguistic vineyard, and wrapping our arms around in that way.
Appreciate those are great words and ideas from all of you. So I think we'll leave it there. But I do want to just thank the 3 of you and then the folks at the law school as well for hosting this. I think it's been a really interesting conversation. Obviously, we could spend a lot more time unpacking all of these issues and ideas, but I felt like this has been certainly informative, and appreciate Professor Moore, your lyricism there. That was great. So thank you all, and I think we'll turn it back over to the team at Vermont Law School.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Take care, guys. Bye-bye.
Thank you guys again so much. We lost Professor Hamilton, but we wanted to ask a final question now that, for Professor Carter with you, who would be your Mount Rushmore in terms of rappers who are women? I mean, you guys listed Tupac Shakur, you guys listed Jay-Z. For me, I think it'd be Lil' Kim or Debrat. Who would be your Mount Rushmore for women rappers?
Queen Latifah.
That's a good one. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, okay. I could go on about her, but we'll leave it there. That's who my Mount Rushmore would be there.
Okay.
I like
you again.
unity.
Thank you.
All right. Take care.
Okay, so again, could we please give a round of applause for our panelists and our moderator? I also want to thank you guys and ask that you give yourself a round of applause for joining us in person for this event. This event was such a success, and we are so proud to just bring it to you guys. When we were planning this symposium since May, we really wanted to amplify issues that were important to Black and brown communities across the nation. And unfortunately, mass incarceration is that issue. It's violently harmful. It is so hard just for folks who are victims of the system. And so we really thank you for coming out and listening to us to this presentation. Through this symposium, again, I was inspired by my note, All Eyes on RAP, the criminalization of artistic expression, to bring to you the various panels, such as Neo No Mas, Our Prisons Obsolete, Cage Creativity, and so we, again, are just so glad that you came to join us, and I'm gonna pass it to Maylee. Hi, y'all. Yeah, so just echoing Maya's gratitude, seeing the turnout in person and virtually was extremely fulfilling, especially since all the work that we've put in. So my motivation behind centering the symposium on mass incarceration was to shed a light, to shed a bright light on the long existing and ongoing discrimination suffered disproportionately by Black and brown communities, which is really in turn our communities. So this is like our real life as well. So like our families, our friends, like this isn't just a hypothetical in our situation. Specifically, I also wanted to ensure that symposium brought to VLGS a rich discussion and edification on detention centers. Though they are not called prisons, the non-citizens in those centers are treated just like inmates. So I think that was a very important discussion to have. And above all, we just really wanted to emphasize and highlight two things: the effects of mass incarceration on Black and brown folks, and the treatment of those incarcerated human beings. We hope the symposium was informative and that you guys enjoyed it. Thank you so much for coming. We also want to give a huge thanks to Greta Razor, our editor-in-chief for Volume 48, and Professor Fergosi, who has been an amazing advisor throughout this experience, and the amazing AV team of Rachel, Bill, and Brian for making sure this went out without a hitch. Just thank you, thank you, thank you. Again, like Maylee and I have said, this entire event, because it's been so amazing. So happy Saturday, y'all. Thanks.